we presented Casper, a novel proof-of-stake system derived from the Byzantine fault tolerance literature. Casper includes 2 slashing conditions, a correct by construction fork choice rule, and dynamic validator sets. Welcome back to Ethereum Audible. Happy Tuesday. Hope you're doing well. Today I'm taking inspiration from the last 2 read-throughs that we did, which were about 2 parts of 3 attacks on proof-of-stake Ethereum, and I realized while reading it that we actually never have gone through, I've never done a read-through of the actual consensus mechanisms for Ethereum proof-of-stake. And that's what I thought I would go back to revisit today, because that's the core, that's the foundation, and we want to go layers under layers deep here. That's what this podcast is about. It's reading the foundational deep reads, deep dives that give us all the understanding of what's going on in Web3 and in Ethereum. And so if we've done those attacks on Ethereum proof of stake, let's dive down the rabbit hole. Let's go down the layers and read about the finality mechanisms, the proof of stake consensus mechanism that underlies Ethereum. Now, at the core of this is actually the proof of stake kind of foundational paper, which is put out by Tendermint in 2014, I think, and we're not going to be reading that today, but that is, I think, the first paper that really lays out proof of stake as a consensus mechanism as opposed to proof of work, and it's based on these PBFT algorithms. And if you don't know what BFT or PBFT is, there is a blockchain bite. I recorded about that a few weeks ago, what Byzantine fault tolerance is and the school of thought and algorithms based around that. But today, and also next week, I want to go into the consensus mechanisms for Ethereum's proof of stake beacon chain. And today we're going to be reading Casper, the friendly finality gadget, which you might recall from last week's read-through, which we call to as Casper FFG, which is friendly finality gadget. And that's what we're going to be reading through today. As always, I want to give a shout out, a commercial support to Alpe Audio, ALPE Audio, which is my startup. It gives me the time to do this, my passion, and well, Alpe Audio is a great place to learn anything in depth on the go. So if you're busy, you want to learn a course, but you want to remember what you learn, really internalize it, take it with you, and put it into practice, apply what you've learned, well, Alpe Audio is the place for that. It's like podcasts, but really souped up online courses in a podcast format with all the bells and whistles that you could hope for. So, without further ado, let's go. Casper, the friendly finality gadget, written by Vitalik Buterin and Virgil Griffith of the Ethereum Foundation. This is from January 2019. Abstract. We introduce Casper, a proof-of-stake-based finality system which overlays an existing proof-of-work blockchain. Casper is a partial consensus mechanism combining proof-of-stake algorithm, research, and Byzantine fault-tolerant consensus theory. We introduce our system, prove some desirable features, and show defenses against long-range revisions and catastrophic crashes. The Casper overlay provides almost any proof-of-work chain with additional protections against block revisions. 1. Introduction. Over the past few years, there has been considerable research into proof-of-stake-based blockchain consensus algorithms. In a proof-of-stake system, a blockchain appends and agrees on new blocks through a process where anyone who holds coins inside of the system can participate, and the influence an agent has is proportional to the number of coins, or stake, it holds. This is a vastly more efficient alternative to proof-of-work, mining, and enables blockchain to operate without mining's high hardware and electricity costs. There are 2 major schools of thought in proof-of-stake design. The first, chain-based proof-of-stake, which mimics proof-of-work mechanics and features a chain of blocks and simulates mining by pseudo-randomly assigning the right to create new blocks to stakeholders. This includes Peercoin, Blackcoin, and Ido Bentov's work. The other school Byzantine fault-tolerant based proof of stake, is based on a 30-year-old body of research into BFT consensus algorithms such as PBFT. BFT algorithms, Byzantine fault tolerance algorithms, typically have proven mathematical properties. For example, one can usually mathematically prove that as long as 2/3 of protocol participants, or greater than 2/3 of protocol participants, are following the protocol honestly, then regardless of network latency, the algorithm cannot finalize conflicting blocks. Repurposing BFT algorithms for proof of stake was first introduced by Tendermint and has modern inspirations. Casper follows this BFT tradition, though with some modifications. 1.1 R work. Casper, the friendly finality gadget, Casper FFG, is an overlay atop a proposal mechanism. A mechanism which proposes blocks. Casper is responsible for finalizing these blocks, essentially selecting a unique chain which represents the canonical transactions of the ledger. Casper provides safety, but liveness depends on the chosen proposal mechanism. That is, if attackers wholly control the proposal mechanism, Casper protects against finalizing two conflicting checkpoints, but the attackers could prevent Casper from finalizing any future checkpoints. Casper introduces several new features that BFT algorithms do not necessarily support. First is accountability. If a validator violates a rule, we can detect the violation and know which validator violated the rule. Accountability allows us to penalize malfeasant validators, solving the nothing at stake problem that plagues chain-based proof of stake. The penalty for violating a rule is a validator's entire deposit. This maximal penalty is the defense against violating the protocol. Because proof of stake security is based on the size of the penalty, which can be set to greatly exceed the gains from the mining reward, proof of stake provides strictly stronger incentives than proof of work. The second is dynamic validators. We introduce a safe way for the validator set to change over time. Third is defenses. We introduce defenses against long-range revision attacks, as well as attacks where more than a third of validators drop offline, at the cost of a very weak trade-off of synchronicity assumption. Fourth is modular overlay. Casper's design as an overlay makes it easier to implement as an upgrade to an existing proof-of-work chain. We describe Casper in stages, starting with a simple version, and then progressively adding a validator set changes, and finally defenses against attacks. Section 2. The Casper Protocol. Within Ethereum, the proposal mechanism will initially be the existing proof-of-work chain, making the first version of Casper a hybrid proof-of-work and proof-of-stake system. In future versions, the proof-of-work proposal mechanism will be replaced with something more efficient. For example, we can imagine converting the block proposal into some kind of proof-of-stake round-robin block signing scheme. In this simple version of Casper, we assume there's a fixed set of validators and a proposal mechanism, for example, the familiar proof-of-work proposal mechanism, which produces child blocks of existing blocks, forming an ever-growing block tree. The root of the tree is typically called the genesis block. Under normal circumstances, we expect that the proposal mechanism will typically propose blocks one after the other in a linked list, as in each parent block having exactly one child block. But in the case of network latency, or deliberate attacks, the proposal mechanism will inevitably occasionally produce multiple children of the same parent. Casper's job is to choose a single child from each parent, thus choosing one canonical chain from the block tree. Rather than deal with a full block tree, for efficiency purposes, Casper only considers the subtree of checkpoints, forming the checkpoint tree. The genesis block is a checkpoint, and every block whose height in the block tree, or block number, is an exact multiple of 100 is also a checkpoint. The checkpoint height of a block with block height of 100 times k is simply k. Equivalently, the height of a checkpoint, c, is the number of elements in the checkpoint chain stretching down from c to the root along the parent links. I'll pause there just to repeat that in my own language because I think this terminology is more confusing than it actually is. Basically, we have a checkpoint block. In Casper, we give it just a random kind of number of every 100 blocks there is a checkpoint. And so the height of the checkpoint is, if you're in block 100, this is checkpoint number 1, block 200, this is checkpoint number 2, and so on. We get to checkpoint number 10, that would be at height 1000, basically, block 1000. So that's how we know the checkpoint number. But also there is the height of the checkpoints and blocks in general, which is simply you count every block all the way back to Genesis. So checkpoint number 10 is at block 1000. Its height is 1000, but it's only checkpoint 10 because we divide by 100. Back to reading. Each validator has a deposit. When a validator joins, its deposit is the number of deposited coins. After joining, each validator's deposit rises and falls with rewards and penalties. Proof of stake's security derives from the size of the deposits, not the number of validators. So for the rest of this paper, when we say 2/3 of validators, we are referring to the deposit weighted fraction. That is, a set of validators whose sum deposit size equals to 2/3 of the total deposit size of the entire set of validators. Validators can broadcast a vote message containing 4 pieces of information. 2 checkpoints, S and T, together with their heights, which is the height of S and the height of T. We require that S be an ancestor of T in the checkpoint tree. Otherwise, the vote is considered invalid. If the public key of the validator is not in the validator set, the vote is considered invalid. Together with the signature of the validator, we will write these votes in the form of the validator's public key, S and T, which are 2 blocks, where S is the ancestor of T, and the height of S and the height of T. We define the following terms. A supermajority link is an ordered pair of checkpoints such that at least 2/3 of validators by deposit have published votes with source A and target B. Supermajority links can skip checkpoints, as in it's perfectly okay for the height of B to be greater than the height of A plus 1, as in skip a checkpoint. In which case you would have, for example, B being checkpoint number 5 and A being checkpoint number 1, so we're skipping checkpoints 2, 3, and 4. And as long as that order exists where B and 5 are in the appropriate set and you have that supermajority of more than 2/3, then that is considered a supermajority link. The next one is 2 checkpoints, A and B, are called conflicting if and only if they are nodes in distinct branches, as in neither is an ancestor or descendant of the other. So here just imagine we have the Genesis block, and from there are 2 branches, 2 blocks that go out, and those checkpoints are considered conflicting if they're in completely different branches where neither is an ancestor or a descendant of the other. A checkpoint C is called justified if, for 2 reasons. 1, it is the root, or there exists a supermajority link where checkpoint C tag is justified. And here C tag would basically be part of that supermajority link that skipped over its own checkpoint. Remember, if we have 5 justifying 1 and there's a supermajority, then you can kind of assume that the checkpoints in between are also justified. A checkpoint C is called finalized. Note that we're at finalized, not justified. If 1, it is the root, or 2, it is justified, and there is a supermajority link where the C tag is a direct child of C. Equivalently, checkpoint C is finalized if and only if checkpoint C is justified and there exists a supermajority link and they are not conflicting. So there's a hierarchy of how you justify and finalize checkpoints, where essentially you can justify things when there's a supermajority link between checkpoints and they're justified, and then you finalize them when we finalize the following, as in the higher height blocks following that justified checkpoint. The most notable property of Casper is that it is impossible for any two conflicting checkpoints to be finalized unless more than a third of the validators violate one of the two Casper commandments or slashing conditions, which are the conditions we just read through. If a validator violates either slashing condition, the evidence of the violation can be included into the blockchain as a transaction, at which point the validator's entire deposit is taken away with a small finder's fee given to the submitter of the evidence transaction. In current Ethereum, stopping the enforcement of a slashing condition requires a successful 51% attack on Ethereum's proof-of-work block proposer. Section 2.1, Proving Safety and Plausible Liveness. We prove Casper's two fundamental properties, accountable safety and plausible liveness. Accountable safety means that two conflicting checkpoints cannot both be finalized unless more than a third of validators violate a slashing condition, meaning at least 1/3 of the total deposit is lost. Plausible liveness means that regardless of any previous events, for example slashing events, delayed blocks, or censorship attacks, if more than 2/3 of validators follow the protocol, then it's always possible to finalize a new checkpoint without any validators violating a slashing condition. Under the assumption that less than a third of the validators by weight violate a slashing condition, we have the following properties. 1. If block S1 leads to block T1 and block S2 leads to T2 are distinct supermajority links, then the height of T1 has to be non-equal to the height of T2. The second is that if S1 leads to T1 and S2 leads to T2, and both are distinct supermajority links, then the inequality of the height of S1, which is lower than the height of S2, which is lower than the height of T2, and lower than the height of T1, this inequality cannot hold. From these two properties, we can immediately see that for any height n, there exists at most one supermajority link where S leads to T, where the height of T equals n, and there exists at most one justified checkpoint with height n. With these four properties in hand, we move to the main theorems. Now, before we move on to the main theorems, I just want to break that down because there's a lot of letters and things like that, and even in writing, it's not the clearest that I think it should be, and in audio, it's definitely not going to come across well. But these laws, these rules, basically are the basis for forming the theorems, which form the next 2 pages of the article. And basically, when you put those theories together, this is the bottom line, which is basically, if you assume that no more than 1/3 of validators are corrupt, as in there you have a 2/3 majority of validators based on their staking deposit, then the rules of Casper hold true. And that is that you cannot have two conflicting checkpoints that are finalized. As in, if you have 2/3 majority, you cannot have two checkpoints that conflict, which means they are on opposing branches. They do not share the same tree. One is not the parent of the other. One is not the descendant of the other. They are on conflicting branches. In that case, two conflicting checkpoints cannot both be finalized, which means that Casper is a finalization mechanism, which is why it's called Casper FFG, Friendly Finalization Gadget. The second theorem that comes from this is that supermajority links can always be added to produce new finalized checkpoints if there exist children extending the finalized chain. This one's important for finalization in the case of conflict. So, and this basically, I'll just repeat that, is that you can always form a supermajority link, which if you remember means that there are checkpoints that are validated in a checkpoint's past, even if it's not the preceding checkpoint. As in checkpoint 5, you can form supermajority link with checkpoint 2, even if you're skipping over checkpoints 3 and 4. And so the second thing that comes from those statements before is that a supermajority link can always be added to produce a new finalized checkpoint if there exist children that extend the finalized chain. And those two theorems that I just described come from these assumptions that we have less than a third of the validators by weight who violate a slashing condition, as in we have a greater than 2/3 majority who are honest and play by the rules. And in those cases, we have those two theorems. And that stems from our discussion before about what justification is, what finalization is, and how a block gets attested and proposed. Moving on to the next section, which is 2.2, Casper's fork choice rules. Casper is more complicated than standard proof of work designs. As such, the fork choice must be adjusted. Our modified fork choice rule should be followed by all users, validators, and even the underlying block proposal mechanism. If the users, validators, or block proposers instead follow the standard proof of work fork choice rule of always build atop the longest chain, there are pathological scenarios where Casper gets stuck, and any blocks built atop the longest chain cannot be finalized or even justified without some validators altruistically sacrificing their deposit. To avoid this, we introduce a novel correct by construction fork choice rule. Follow the chain containing the justified checkpoint of the greatest height. This fork choice rule is correct by construction because it follows from the plausible liveliness proof, which is the second theorem, which precisely states that it's always possible to finalize a new checkpoint on top of the justified checkpoint with the greatest height. This fork choice rule will be tweaked in sections 3 and 4. So I'm just going to stop there because the fork choice rule in classic Bitcoin proof of work is simple, and it's you always build on top of the longest chain. You see two chains, one has forked, the other, one is shorter than the other, go with the longer chain. That's the chain with the most proof of work. That's the chain that you build on. But with Casper's fork choice, with the Casper mechanism, that doesn't necessarily always work, because there are some edge case scenarios where Casper could get stuck, and blocks that are built on top of the longest chain cannot necessarily be finalized. And so that rule of follow the longest chain, follow the chain with the most proof of work, gets tweaked to follow the chain containing the justified checkpoint of the greatest height. Justification, just as a reminder, is a case where you have a justified block that has a descendant that comes from it and is also justified. Basically, you need these supermajority links to create justification. And supermajority links are checkpoints that are descendants, one from the other, where you have a supermajority which is greater than 2/3 of validators who have validated that and attested to it. And so this fork choice rule is you follow the chain containing the justified checkpoint of the greatest height. So if you have a checkpoint that's not justified, then that doesn't count for the fork choice rule. Section 3, enabling dynamic validator sets. The set of validators needs to be able to change. New validators must be able to join, and existing validators must be able to leave. To accomplish this, we define the dynasty of a block. The dynasty of a block B is the number of finalized checkpoints in the chain from root to the parent block of B. When a would-be validator's deposit message is included in a block with dynasty D, then the validator will join the validator set at first block with dynasty D+2. We call D+2 this validator's start dynasty. So basically what's being said here is that in Ethereum's proof of stake chain, we need a dynamic validator set because validators are joining and they're leaving, right? Because we can stake and unstake. So how do you know when someone has joined the validator pool? The rule here is that from the moment that we see the message of, hey, I want to be a validator, here's my deposit, what they call a deposit message, then the validator joins the validator set at the first block of D+2, where the +2 indicates the number of checkpoints, not necessarily individual blocks afterwards, so 2 checkpoints later. To leave the validator set, a validator must send a withdraw message. If the validator's withdraw message is included in a block with dynasty D, it similarly leaves the validator set at the first block with dynasty D+2. We call D+2 the validator's end dynasty. If a withdraw message has not yet been included, then there is no end of dynasty. Once a validator leaves the validator set, the validator's public key is forever forbidden from rejoining the validator set. This removes the need to handle multiple start and end dynasties for a single identifier. At the start of the end dynasty, the validator's deposit is locked for a long period of time, called the withdrawal delay, approximately 4 months' worth of blocks, before the deposit is withdrawn. If during the withdrawal delay the validator violates any commandment, the deposit is slashed. We define 2 functions that generate 2 subsets of validators for any given dynasty: forward validator set and the rear validator set. To support these dynamic validator sets, we redefine a supermajority link and a finalized checkpoint as follows. And I'm just going to remind you what a supermajority link is. I'm going to scroll back a few pages for this, and here it is. A supermajority link is an ordered pair of checkpoints A and B, where at least 2/3 of validators have published votes with source A and target B. Supermajority links can skip checkpoints. Remember 5 and 4, and instead of skipping from 5 to 4, it's skipping from 5 to 2. But that's what a supermajority link is. It's where 2/3 at least of validators have published votes with a source of A and the target of B. So back to support these dynamic validator sets, we redefine a supermajority link and a finalized checkpoint as follows. An ordered pair of checkpoints, S to T, where T is in dynasty D, has a supermajority link if both at least 2/3 of the forward validator set of dynasty D have published votes where S leads to T, and at least 2/3 of the rear validator set of dynasty D have published votes where S leads to T. Additionally, previously a checkpoint C was called finalized if C is justified, and there is a supermajority link from C to C tag where C tag is a child of C. We now add the condition that C is finalized only if the votes for the supermajority link of C to C tag, as well as the supermajority link justifying C, are included in C tag's blockchain, and before the child of C tag, as in before the block number of the height of C tag times 100, which is the checkpoints, plus 1. The forward and rear validator set will usually greatly overlap, but if the 2 validator sets substantially differ, this stitching mechanism prevents safety failure in the case when 2 grandchildren of a finalized checkpoint have different dynasties, because the evidence was included in one chain, but not the other. 4. Stopping attacks. There are 2 well-known attacks against proof-of-stake systems: long-range revisions and catastrophic crashes. We discuss each in turns. I will just pause for a second, and now we have an appreciation for additional kinds of attacks that are not long-range revisions or catastrophic crashes, but rather short-term reorgs. Back to reading. 4.1 Long-range revisions. The withdrawal delay after a validator's end dynasty introduces a synchronicity assumption between validators and clients. Once a coalition of validators has withdrawn their deposits, if that coalition has more than 2/3 of deposits long ago in the past, they can use their historical supermajority to finalize conflicting checkpoints without fear of getting slashed, because they have already withdrawn their money. This is called the long-range revision attack. In simple terms, long-range attacks are prevented by a fork choice rule to never revert a finalized block, as well as an expectation that each client will log on and gain complete up-to-date view of the chain at some regular frequency, for example, once per month or so. A long-range revision fork that finalizes blocks older than that will simply be ignored, because all clients will have already seen a finalized block at the height and will refuse to revert it. We make an informal proof of the mechanism as follows. Suppose that there is a maximum communication delay of delta between two clients. So if one client hears some message, all other clients are guaranteed to have heard it by some time plus that delta. This means that we can talk about the time window during which a block was received by the network. We assume that all clients have local clocks that are perfectly synchronized, and blocks are required to have timestamps. If a client has a local time of TL, then it will reject blocks whose timestamp of TB satisfies the fact that their timestamp is later than the TL, as in it comes from the future. And they will refuse to accept as finalized, but may still accept it as part of the chain. Blocks where the timestamp of the block comes from too far in the past. If a validator sees a slashing violation at some time t, that's the time they hear the later of the two voices required for a flashing violation, then they reject blocks with timestamps that are greater than that t, that are part of chains that have not yet included this slashing evidence. So suppose that a large set of slashing violations results in two conflicting finalized checkpoints, C1 and C2. If the two time windows do not intersect, then all validators agree with which checkpoint came first, and everyone follows the rule to not revert finalized checkpoints, then there is no issue. If the two time windows do intersect, then we can handle the case as follows. If the time stamps do intersect, then we can assume that by twice the normal time window that the maximum communication delay exists, which we called before delta, so twice of that delta, we can assume that all of the nodes, all of the validators in the network have heard about this slashing violation. And if you recall, we just instituted a fourth mechanism, a fourth informal proof that stated if a validator sees a slashing violation at time t, then they reject blocks with timestamps that are t plus 2 delta. So we know that they're in the future and that they should have seen that slashing violation. So we reject blocks in that future that are part of chains that have not yet included this slashing evidence, because we assume that they should have known, and therefore if they haven't put it in there, then they are colluding. So if we take that together with the fact that we're taking this time gap that should let all validators who are honest know, we can safely assume that as long as the withdrawal period of that stake is greater than at least kind of twice that amount, which is 4 delta, it's guaranteed that malfeasant validators will lose their deposits in all chains that any client accepts. That's because we hard-coded those assumptions. Now, due to network delays, it's possible that clients will disagree whether a given piece of slashing evidence was submitted into a given chain on time or as having accepted it too late. However, this is only a liveness failure, not a safety failure. And this possibility does not weaken our security claim because it is already known that a corrupted proposal mechanism, which would be required to prevent evidence inclusion, can prevent finality. We can also sidestep the issue of evidence inclusion timeouts by informally arguing that attacks will be short-lived because the validators will perceive a long-running chain without including slashing evidence as an attack and switch to another branch supported by an honest minority of validators that are not part of the attack, thus stopping the attack and slashing the attacker. 4.2 Catastrophic Crashes. Suppose that more than a third of validators crash fail at the same time, as in they are no longer connected to the network due to a network partition, computer failure, or the validators themselves are malicious. Intuitively, from this point on, no supermajority links can be created, and thus no future checkpoints can be finalized. We can recover from this by instituting an inactivity leak, which slowly drains the deposit of any validator that does not vote for checkpoints, until eventually its deposit sizes decrease low enough that the validators who are voting are a supermajority. The simplest formula is something like In every epoch, a validator with deposit size D fails to vote. It loses D times some amount. Though to resolve catastrophic crashes more quickly, a formula which increases the leak rate in the event of a long streak of 9 non-finalized blocks may be optimal. This drained ether can be burned or returned to the validator after some amount of days. Whether leaked assets should be burned or returned, as well as the exact formula for the inactivity leak, is outside the scope of this paper, as these are questions of economic incentives, not Byzantine fault tolerance. The inactivity leak introduces the possibility of two conflicting checkpoints being finalized without any validator getting slashed, with validators only losing money on only one of the two checkpoints. Assume the validators are split into two subsets, with subset VA voting on chain A and subset VB voting on chain B. On chain A, VB's deposits will leak, and vice versa, leading to each subset having a supermajority on its respective chain, allowing two conflicting checkpoints to be finalized without any validators being explicitly slashed, but each subset will lose a large portion of their deposit on one of the two chains due to leaks. If this situation happens, then each validator should simply favor whatever finalized checkpoint it saw first. The exact algorithm for recovering from these various attacks remains an open problem. For now, we assume validators can detect obviously malfeasant behavior, for example not including evidence, and manually create a minority soft fork. This minority fork can be viewed as a blockchain in its own right that competes with the majority chain in the market. And if the majority chain truly is operated by colluding malicious attackers, then we can assume that the market will favor the minority fork. 5 conclusions. We presented Casper, a novel proof-of-stake system derived from the Byzantine fault tolerance literature. Casper includes 2 slashing conditions, a correct by construction fork choice rule, and dynamic validator sets. Finally, we introduced extensions to Casper to defend against 2 common attacks. Casper remains imperfect. For example, a wholly compromised block proposal mechanism will prevent Casper from finalizing new blocks. Casper is a proof-of-stake based strict security improvement on almost any proof-of-work chain. The problems that Casper does not wholly solve, particularly related to 51% attacks, can still be corrected using user-activated soft forks. Future developments will undoubtedly improve Casper's security and reduce the need for user-activated soft forks. Future work. The current Casper system builds upon a proof-of-work block proposal mechanism. We wish to convert the block proposal mechanism to proof-of-stake. We wish to prove accountable safety and plausible liveness even when the weights of the validator set change with rewards and penalties. Another problem for future work is a formal specification of a fork choice rule taking into account the common attacks on proof-of-stake. Future work papers will explain and analyze the financial incentives within Casper and their consequences. A particular economic problem related to such automated strategies to block attackers is proving upper bounds on the ratio between the degree of disagreement between different clients and the cost incurred by the attacker. So that is Casper, the friendly Finality Gadget. It's only 10 pages long, but as you could tell, it's super, super dense. It's not always the easiest to understand. I hope that breaking it up in the middle helped make it concrete. There are some figures and graphs inside, especially that help really understand it better, especially when we get to the more, not really mathematical, but algebraic sessions. But what I want to do now is I kind of want to just review it from a high level so that it sits firmly in your mind, at least the main points. So from a top level, Casper is a finality gadget that helps decide what block is the final block in the blockchain. It's not a proposal mechanism, which would be proof of work or proof of stake, which is the underlying who gets to propose and build the new block. This is the mechanism that sits on top of that and says, this is the right one, this is the wrong one, this is the right one, this is the wrong one. And Casper introduces a few new things that the traditional BFT, the Byzantine fault tolerance schools of work, did not. Those 4 things are accountability, which is the slashing, which solves the nothing at stake problem, The other one is dynamic validators, since we assume that in a proof of stake system we have a validator set coming in and coming out, cycling in and out often, and defenses against long-range attacks, as well as kind of catastrophic failure attacks. Those are the three core things that Casper FFG brings to the table. Now, the protocol is built around some core assumptions and the theorems or proofs that emerge from them. It really comes down to breaking down the tree of blocks into checkpoints, which in the paper, it's just kind of randomly decided that every 100 blocks is a checkpoint. And achieving finality among checkpoints is key to consensus and preventing of long-term attacks. So every validator, when they broadcast a vote message, contains a few pieces of information. So we have S, the source, and that's basically the hash of a justified checkpoint. Then we have the target T, which is the checkpoint hash that is the descendant of S, our source. We have the height of those checkpoints in the tree, so the height of the S, the source, and the height of T, the target. And then we have the signature of the validator who is signing. Remember, if we have more than 2/3 of the validator set who operate according to this, then there are a few rules that Casper kind of brings to bear in its finality mechanism. And that is that you can't have a source that leads to a target and another source that leads to a different target being attested by more than 2/3 that are on conflicting trees. So you can't have that kind of conflicting trees where 2/3 of the validator pool are honest and they're voting for. And that comes to prevent a fork, basically. And the paper succinctly puts that as, quote, two conflicting checkpoints, AM and BN, cannot both be finalized. Right, so that's one thing that comes out of that rule. The second one, which is really important for what we found one of the attacks later on, is that a supermajority link can always be added to produce new finalized checkpoints, provided there exist children extending the finalized chain. So if we can assume that we have at least 2/3 of the validator set who are honestly attesting that here is the source block and its hash, here is the target checkpoint block and its hash, they connect to each other, and we have 2/3 of a majority who are doing that, then those two rules apply. Now, naturally, this assumes that we really have 2/3 of the validators as being honest and participating according to the protocol rules. That's really the core assumption of all BFT schools of thought, that we have a greater than 2/3 majority as participating honestly. So if we have that, Casper brings us that finality mechanism. It also brings us a fork choice rule, which is different from Bitcoin's. Whereas Bitcoin's is build on the longest chain, Casper's is follow the chain containing the justified checkpoint of the greatest height. So it's follow the longest chain where we have the longest justified checkpoint. And justified checkpoint is one that has been superlinked majority, basically, to another justified checkpoint, which means that we have that 2/3 majority. Now, one of the reasons why we need something like Casper in proof of stake, whereas in proof of work, we have, Bitcoin's much simpler rule of just follow the longest chain. Well, it comes from two things. One of them is that in proof of work, you are literally solving the hash problem to submit your block. Whereas in proof of stake, that's not the case. And therefore, you can have different conflicting blocks being proposed simultaneously. Especially when in Bitcoin, the difficulty is one block is found on average every 10 minutes, give or take, right? And that limits the attack surface also just from a network perspective. Whereas in Ethereum, it's every 12 to 15 seconds. And so from just a purely network perspective, that's more borderline in terms of other blocks that could be proposed in a time frame that we could still think it actually makes sense. And so in Ethereum, especially under proof of stake, although this also exists in the current proof of work, just because the finality, the difficulty to hash the next block, to find that hash for the next block isn't as hard because we're finding one every 10 or 12 seconds. You need a mechanism that supports a kind of more nuanced fork choice rule. How do we know that it's this block and not that block, right? Because you can imagine in Ethereum, unlike in Bitcoin, you have a new block every 10 or 12 seconds, and well, look at that. We have another block and another block and another block and another block, and we've kind of been running 2 forks simultaneously over 2 minutes, but in those 2 minutes, there are already 30, 40 blocks. That's a pretty long reversion. Whereas in Bitcoin, it would take a much, much longer time frame, and it's statistically less probable. And so you need this kind of mechanism to help finality, which is why Casper works even on top of the proof of work. In proof of stake, where there is no hashing, there is no difficulty challenge, it's just proposal based on the stake you have, well, the problem becomes kind of more acute. You need to be able to finalize between conflicting blocks, between branches, between trees. So that's why you need this kind of finality gadget on top of the proof of stake. It's not as simple as saying, well, it's now your turn, then it's your turn, then it's your turn, then it's your turn. Because as we saw in last week's read of 3 attacks on proof of stake Ethereum, what if someone holds back their block and then only releases it later? What if someone missed their block and only, comes and kind of reclaims their slot 5 minutes down the line? What if someone just tries to spoof the network and say, hey, it's my turn? And they manage to convince a lot of people, because for some they manage to pay them off with MEV, and for some, they just manage to convince them otherwise. I don't know. There are all kinds of different scenarios in a proof of stake because there is no proof of work required to submit your block. As long as you're part of the validator set, you are a legitimate block proposer. So that's why the Casper Finality Gadget is actually very, very important. Now, I will just kind of final word here. This was written in 2019. A lot of the future work has already been done and incorporated. And since then, we've also discovered new vectors of attack like MEV and the attacks we discussed over the past 2 weeks. So there has been a lot of progress here since this paper came out 3 years ago, as well as some modifications. And some of those modifications are what we're going to be reading over the next week or two. But this core thought process of justification, finalization, checkpoints, and a finality gadget on top of proof of work or proof of stake, this Casper paper is really the base layer for Ethereum's finality gadget. And that's why I wanted to read through it and tried my best to make it as understandable as possible, even with a dense paper like this.